Hello everyone, my name is Sarah and today we're going to be talking about self-care. You'll notice that my hair is in this really awkward stage of growing out. I've had it shaved for 2 years and then I grew it out to dye it green and then I had it shaved another point for a couple months. So I've had my head shaved for a very long time. The boyfriend I have now literally has never seen me with hair longer than this, because usually when it gets to this point where it looks weird, that's when I'm like, okay, I will shave it off again. But I'm trying to grow it out, so we're just gonna have to stick with this like weird stuff that's going on here until this gets heavy enough to fall flat, hopefully, soon. The back's still okay, maybe I should clean up the sides soon. But anyway, my hair is not the point of this video. Let me correct you guys. The point of this video is to have clean glasses. No, the point of this video is to talk about self-care. Now, I've heard a lot of discussions about self-care where it seems like there's two sides kind of combating against each other. I've seen some arguments for self-care as something you do before you're stressed, which I'm pretty sure does come from mental health, and there's a word for it, and I'm sure I'll think of it at some point when I'm done cleaning my glasses. And then I've heard other people argue that self-care should be something you do afterwards, or more accurately, I've never really heard people argue that self-care should be something you do after you're stressed, but I've heard people say that it's okay to take a day off if you're overly stressed, and I've heard a lot of people argue against this idea and say you should be doing self-care to avoid getting that stressed in the first place. And then I've also heard a lot of discussions about self-care as, you know, this thing that capitalists have taken over, the idea of self-care as buying things, as consuming products, and then people saying that self-care shouldn't be about consumption. You shouldn't, go spend a bunch of money for self-care because that doesn't really care for yourself. And then I've heard other people argue that, actually, I don't think I've heard people argue this, but I would argue to that we live in a capitalist society, and therefore, in some ways, we are going to have to buy things for self-care. Occasionally, buying things can be self-care. It just has to be done in a way where you are aware of what you're doing and why you're doing it and why you're buying it, and not just buying mindlessly for self-care. And then there's other arguments about whether self-care should be doing things you enjoy, or self-care should be forcing yourself to do things you don't enjoy that will make you feel less stressed later. Things like, I don't like showering. Don't like it. I used to like it, but I don't really like it much anymore. It stresses me out. But it is something I have to do for obvious reasons. And so some people would suggest that self-care would be, if you can't shower that day, that's okay. And other people would argue that self-care is forcing yourself to do that. And I think that a lot of these discussions, like I've said, that I've heard at least, seem to be, especially outside of the mental health space, because inside the mental health space is an entirely different story, but outside of the mental health space, in just the general atmosphere, there's a lot of conversations about what self-care should be and shouldn't be. And that, to me, that's not something I personally believe in, and here is why. These conversations about what self-care should be and shouldn't be and how to do self-care properly kind of reminds me of the ways in which a lot of people in my life have tried to imply that certain coping mechanisms were good versus certain coping mechanisms are bad. Like, it's bad to cope in one way, but it's good to cope in a different way. And while in some ways I agree with that core message, like coping with alcoholism probably isn't good. I've also seen people cope with a beer with friends and they're just fine because it's not their only coping mechanism. And I think that's kind of the bit that gets left under the wayside with both these conversations, is like coping mechanisms, the idea, at least for me where I am now, the idea of coping mechanisms is to get as many coping mechanisms in my tool belt as possible. That way, when the appropriate situation comes up where I need that tool, I can have it accessible to me, because not every coping mechanism is going to be good in every situation. A lot of these coping mechanisms are situational. I have a couple different mental health issues. I have BPD, I have major depressive disorder, and I have social anxiety. And depending on which disorder is really taking the forefront, or which ones possibly are taking the forefront, I use different coping mechanisms because they're different situations and they're going to react differently. Different coping mechanisms are better for my anxious brain as opposed to my depressive brain as opposed to my BPD brain. I need different tools for each of these things, and then within those subcategories I need different tools for if my anxiety is more of an overthinking, like headspace anxiety, where I'm overthinking, where I'm catastrophizing, versus an anxiety that's more like right in the gut or the heart, where it's more fight, flight, freeze, fawn response or trauma response. Those two things within anxiety need different coping mechanisms to help me the best way they can. And so limiting my coping mechanisms does not, in the long run, help me in any way. It just means I have less tools to use against a variety of different situations that I'm not going to be able to predict. And I would like to assert that the way we view self-care, if it's in this limited, you should do this, you shouldn't do that way, is the same thing. You are limiting your tool belt. You're limiting the ways in which you think you are allowed to do self-care, and therefore you don't have the tools for every situation, because I think self-care is situational. I think, like I said, obviously there's some self-care methods that are less preferable, like drinking. We could probably switch out with something more healthy, but a coping mechanism is probably better than no coping mechanism. Some self-care is better than no self-care at all. And I think it is important to have these conversations, especially around, at least for me, like consumption and self-care, and the ways in which capitalists have dictated to us that self-care means buying things, spending money, and untangling that and figuring out where that comes from, and realizing that buying things is not good self-care if that is not the type of self-care you need at that moment. Because, like I said, we live in a capitalist society, and sometimes self-care means buying things. But situations where self-care means buying things might be something like you don't have any shampoo and you haven't showered in 2 weeks. What are you going to do without buying something? You need shampoo. You need to buy shampoo. Self-care might be, you want to buy a candle because you have always found candles really relaxing. The part where it stops becoming self-care and it starts becoming consumption for the sake of consumption because we've linked consumption with self-care is when you don't analyze why you're doing it, or if you really need that product for self-care. There is a strong argument to be made that maybe self-care isn't buying another candle if you already have 5 in the house that you never use. Self-care might be instead limiting what you buy and realizing you don't need that thing, and instead using what you have. that can be self-care, but there are situations where buying something might be self-care, and it often is self-care. So I don't want to sit here and pretend that there are ways to self-care that are better than others. I think a lot of it comes down to intention, a lot of it comes down to situation, and a lot of it comes down to what you need right now. Because, like I said, any coping mechanism is usually better than no coping mechanism, and I think the same could probably be said about self-care. Of course, there are lots of different ways you can use self-care, and knowing more of those ways is going to be beneficial to you, because then you can specifically self-care in a way that helps you in the moment. So preventative self-care is really important. It's important to know things you can do in the moment to de-stress yourself so that you never get past the point of breaking. But it is also unrealistic to expect that you will never get to a point where you will get past the point of breaking. Everyone has their limits, and life, if life has taught me anything at 25, 26, however old I am about to be when I post this video, my birthday is soon. If life has taught me anything in these long, confusing years of existing, it's that life is unpredictable. It will throw shit at you when you least expect it. And sometimes you will just be at the point of breaking, and you will need coping mechanisms for when you are past that point. It will happen to you. It has happened to me many times. It will happen to you. And so ignoring that and pretending that all the self-care you will ever need in your whole life are going to be methods of self-care that involve you not getting that stress. Preventative self-care is not going to benefit you if you are in a situation where you are past that point. When something really bad happens, you're going to need those methods of self-care for once you are overly stressed, once your mental health has really taken a dive, for when things are really hitting the fan. You need those coping mechanisms. And so instead of learning those coping mechanisms when you need them, I think it's a better way to live, to take on the tools, to take on every aspect of self-care that you can, to learn how to do them in a time where you don't necessarily need them, and to practice them and to get good at them. Because self-care, like coping mechanisms, can be learned. Everything can be learned if therapy and my mental health journey has taught me anything, it's that most things can be learned and improved upon, and our brains are malleable and we are able to learn new things. It's, I think, best to have options, to know what you can do when you're not stressed to keep yourself from being stressed, but also to know what to do when you're a little bit stressed, a lot stressed, and then when you're at your breaking point, having a panic attack or an anxiety attack, to know how to handle those as well. Just knowing one or the other isn't going to give you the most benefit, because as much as you do preventative self-care, there is going to come a time where shit's hitting the fan, where, in my case, your dad's dying, or you are seeing things and not sleeping at night. Stuff happens and you can't predict it. And so you need those methods for self-care that work when you are at your breaking point or past your breaking point. And you also need self-care for preventative measures. The other thing I'd like to say about preventative versus non-preventative self-care measures is that I've heard a lot of people talk about taking days off and assuming that taking days off are not preventative, but taking time for yourself, taking time off, taking a day to yourself can be preventative. You don't have to take a day off when you're already at your breaking point. You can take a day off when you realize that you haven't taken a day off in a while, that you are getting maybe just a little bit stressed and that you need to calm down. You can take a day off when you realize that you've been focusing for me, too much on other people and what they not want and what they need and how they're doing. And you can say, I need a break for myself to refocus on myself and my needs, to remember what I need and what I can do for myself when I'm taking care of other people. Taking a day off isn't just for when you are at your breaking point or past your breaking point. Taking a day off can be preventative. Take a day off before you have before you're so stressed that you can't function. Take a day off before you get to that point, okay? That's just what I'm saying. Some of the things that people think aren't preventative can be preventative if done before you hit your breaking point. Both of those things are necessary. What was the other one? Now, as for doing things you need to do versus doing things you want to do as self-care, again, my approach is balanced. You should be doing both. And I know this because I have tried to hyper-focus on things I need to do, and I've tried to hyper-focus on things I want to do, and neither of those things by themselves have really helped me much. It has only been in my most recent lapse of therapy where I've talked through this kind of idea in my head about my conflict of I have things I need to do, but I have things I want to do. And so I get in this spiral where I think about all the things I need to do, so I don't do the things I want to do. And because I don't do the things I want to do, I don't allow myself time to relax. And therefore, I'm less equipped to do the things I need to do, because for me, there are certain things that just take more energy than others, especially after I had an incident with seeing things. After that year, there are certain things that are much more stressful than they were as a kid. Showering, for example. It used to be something I loved to do, and it would be something I wanted to do. And I'm starting to get back into that now that it's been 5-ish years. But sometimes it's still hard to get in a shower when, showers used to really trigger me to see things and have hallucinations and have paranoia. It used to trigger paranoia in me. And so now I have an association with showers and paranoia. And even though that is not the case most of the time these days, and I can shower at night, I can shower all the time and not get paranoid most of the time. And even when I do, it's a very low level of paranoia, and I can usually just combat it. It still has those memories for me, and so showering takes more energy. And so if I was only focusing on the things I needed to do, looking for jobs, taking care of my body, like showering, brushing my teeth, doing the dishes, doing the laundry, I burn out, and then I can't do those things. But similarly, for obvious reasons, if I only focused on the things I wanted to do, if I only ever painted, read books, played on my Switch, whatever else I like to do, played with makeup, bought things, consumed, all of that stuff, I would never get anything done. I would get in these cycles of being so stressed because the house was dirty constantly, and I would never clean it because I was so stressed about it, and it would just build up and build up. And so in a lot of ways, I understand these ideas people talk about how you shouldn't just use the idea of looking after yourself as a way to do things you like. Sometimes it is important to do things you don't like for your mental health. Sometimes you gotta get in the fucking shower. Sometimes you gotta do some fucking dishes, and that will alleviate some stress in you, and you'll be more able to focus on things you enjoy doing, and other tasks that need to get done will become easier. Doing one thing snowballs into doing more things. Like, if the whole house is dirty but my room is clean, I'm much more happy to do the dishes, and they take up a lot less time and energy in my brain because it's not like, oh my God, I have to do the whole house and I have to start with the dishes, and I hate doing dishes. I've worked as a professional dishwasher for many years, but house dishes are awful. I hate them. My point is that these two things are best when done together, when you do things that you need to get done, but you also do things you want to get done together at the same time. Literally, I had like 3 therapy sessions just dedicated to my therapist drilling that into my head of like, why not both? Why can't you do both of those things? Why can't they coexist? I think for me, it was really important to learn that you could and should do both. And that's really, if you haven't gathered by now, that is my theory on all of this. Is I find a lot of people talk about self-care in ways that make it seem like you shouldn't be doing certain types of self-care, that certain types of self-care are bad or worse than others, and you should stick to the one superior self-care method. But that's not true. It's never been true for me, and I've had a lot of reasons I needed to do self-care. I pretty much need to do self-care constantly to just function in society. This is what I'm saying. I have a lot of practice trying to do self-care and see what works and what doesn't work, because I'm someone that kind of relies on self-care and coping mechanisms and those things to get by. And it has never benefited me to view the world in this kind of black and white manner when it comes to self-care. And I see a lot of people perpetuating this very narrow black and white, you can do this or you can do this, but you can't do them both. They're at opposite ends of the spectrum, so you gotta pick a side, but there's no side. Self-care is a set of tools that you can have in your tool belt to pull out when you need them. Sometimes, maybe you need a screwdriver. In other words, sometimes maybe you'll need to shower. Sometimes maybe you'll need a wrench and you'll need to paint. Sometimes you need to buy stuff. I don't like it, but sometimes you need to buy things. Sometimes you don't have any shampoo and you gotta buy some goddamn shampoo because you haven't showered in 2 weeks and you really need to fucking shower until you buy things. Sometimes you don't have any food in your house and you need to buy food. Sometimes, this is one that I think a lot of people struggle with, because buying clothes is seen as so consumerist. But sometimes your clothes don't fit. Sometimes all you own are things that fit you when your hips were much smaller, or your boobs were smaller, or your, belly was smaller. Sometimes your clothes stop fitting, and then you only have a single pair of sweatpants and a pair of jeans that are so torn up because you like them that way that you can't wear them in winter, and so you've been wearing the same pair of sweatpants all of quarantine, 6 to 8 months of just that one pair of sweatpants, and you realize that you've been holding off buying a pair of pants because you thought that consuming things couldn't be self-care. But in this situation, buy a goddamn pair of pants, because you will feel much better and happier if you had 2 pairs of pants as opposed to 1 pair of pants you could wear. And then when you buy that pair of pants and you figure out how you feel about them, maybe get a 3rd pair of pants. Maybe 3 pairs of pants is a good amount of pants, or at least certainly better than 1 pair of pants. That very long, specific point to say, sometimes you gotta buy shit. Sometimes buying shit is self-care. Sometimes it's not, but sometimes it is. And it really depends on the situation. All these things are situational, and having all of these different aspects of self-care at your disposal can only benefit you, because even if you have self-care methods that maybe aren't the best, like drinking with your friends, or like having a beer or having a cider in my case, because beer is gross. I won't fight about it, but beer is gross. Beer is gross. Sorry. Point. What's the point? The point is, some of these things we view as not good ways of self-care might not be things you want to pull out all the time. Might be things that you want to limit your access to, but excluding them from your tool belt also isn't necessarily the answer. I think it's also a conversation about time. Unlearning behaviors, at least for me, is always a lot harder than learning new ones. Like, I could pick up, if I wanted to remove something from my tool belt, that's going to take a lot more time and effort from me than to just add 2 or 3 new tools in. So instead of removing a tool from my tool belt, I can add more in. And by having more tools of self-care, I'm able to pull those out instead of the one that maybe isn't appropriate for most circumstances. So like having a drink with your buddies in some circumstances can, and has for me personally, been an effective way of self-care. Sometimes when I was in college before all of this was happening, we would go hang out at the bar and socialize and make jokes and have a beer or two, and that would really help me and my mood and my feelings, because I was getting socialization in. I was living the college experience that I didn't get the first round because I started seeing things and stopped sleeping at night. You know, I was getting all these benefits from it, but it wasn't something I should be using all the time, but it was helpful. It was a good thing to have in my tool belt, and I still keep it in my tool belt now, even though I can't do it right now for obvious reasons. But also, it's not something I can do all the time with my anxiety. It's just not. But having it in my tool belt is still helpful, because just because you have a way of self-care in your tool belt does not mean you have to pull it out every opportunity. The reason a lot of people get stuck using the same method of self-care over and over and over again is because that's all they know. That's all that's in their tool belt. So instead of trying to pull that one out of their tool belt, in a lot of ways, it can be easier to pull something new in. So if all you have is drinking in your tool belt and you suddenly get this new method of self-care, you can rely on that new method more and only pull out drinking when you absolutely need to. And so by pulling in as many methods of self-care as possible, you allow yourself to not rely on old methods of self-care as much. You effectively pull old habits away from you because you don't need them as much anymore. So instead of focusing on banishing the old tools of saying some things are self-care and some things are not self-care and you should self-care in one particular way, instead of viewing it as black and white, you can just add as many tools as possible into your belt and then focus on learning how and when those tools should be applied and when they're best applied. And that takes time and it takes effort, but it has been tremendously helpful for me, and I'm sure it would be tremendously helpful for others as well. This black and white thinking is not self-care. It's not the end-all be-all. We don't need to fight over what is and isn't self-care. It can all be self-care in different situations. And those are my thoughts about the current state of self-care dialogue. I will see you guys next week. Bye! I was bad at that YouTube old school transition, but I don't have anything else, so